One theory to explain the apparently paradoxical relationship of accelerated rural-urban migration in the context of rising urban unemployment has come to be known as the Todaro migration model and its equilibrium form as the Harris-Todaro model. The Todaro model postulates that migration proceeds in response to urban-rural differences in expected income rather than actual earnings. The fundamental premise is that migrants consider the various labor market opportunities available to them in the rural and urban sectors and choose the one that maximizes their expected gains from migration. So, the Todaro migration model assumes that members of the labor force, both actual and potential, compare their expected incomes for a given time horizon in the urban sector or the difference between returns and the cost of migration with prevailing average rural incomes and migrate if the former exceeds the latter. On the other hand, we have the Harris-Todaro model or its equilibrium form of Todaro migration. It predicts that expected incomes will be equated across rural and urban sectors when taking into account informal sector activities and outright unemployment. So here is the mathematical formulation of the Harris-Todaro model where I will not explain further. So there are many ways to extend the model. Here we mention four. So first, we simplify by assuming that those who migrate and do not get a modern job receives no income, but if they instead receive urban informal sector income, we modify expected income accordingly. Second, note that if instead of assuming that all urban migrants are the same, we incorporate the reality of different levels of human capital or education, so we can understand why a higher proportion of a rural educated migrate than the uneducated because they have a better chance or a higher probability of earning even higher urban wages than unskilled migrants. Third, we often observe that migrants from the same rural region tend to settle in common cities, even the same neighborhoods of cities that are relatively distant from the migrants' place of origin. In a model proposed by William Carrington, Enrica de Tragace, and Tara Wiswanath earlier, migrants create a positive externality for later potential migrants from their home region by lowering their cost of moving by helping with resettlement and lowering their probability of unemployment by providing them with jobs of information about available jobs. Fourth is that Todaro and Harris-Todaro models are relevant to the developing countries even if the wage is not fixed by institutional forces such as minimum wage. Recent theoretical research in rural-urban migration has confirmed that the emergence of a high modern sector wage alongside unemployment or an urban traditional sector, as seen in these models, can also result from market responses to imperfect information, cost of labor turnover, efficiency wage payments, and other common features of labor markets. So when we say labor turnover, it is a worker separations from employers, a concept used in theory that the urban-rural wage gap is partly explained by the fact that urban modern sector employers pay higher wages to reduce labor turnover rates and retain trained and skilled workers. And efficiency wage is the notion that modern sector urban employers pay higher wage than the equilibrium wage rate in order to attract and retain a higher quality workforce or to obtain higher productivity on the job. Third is the induced migration, the process in which the creation of urban job raises expected incomes and induces more people to migrate from rural areas. And lastly, the wage subsidy or a government financial incentive to private employers to hire more workers as through tax deductions for new job creations. First is the imbalances in urban-rural employment opportunities caused by the urban bias, particularly first city bias of development strategies must be reduced. So because migrants are assumed to respond to differentials in expected incomes, it is vitally important that imbalance between economic opportunities in rural and urban sectors be minimized. Second, urban job creation is an insufficient solution for the urban unemployment problem. So the traditional or the Keynesian economic solution to urban unemployment or the creation of more urban modern sector jobs without simultaneous attempts to improve rural incomes and employment opportunities can result in the paradoxical situation in which more urban employment leads to higher levels of urban unemployment. So once again, the imbalance in in expected income earning opportunities is the crucial concept because migration rates are assumed to respond positively to both higher urban wages and higher urban unemployment opportunities or probabilities. It follows that for any given positive urban rural wage differential in most developing countries, urban wages are typically 3 to 4 times as large as rural wages. Third is the indiscriminate educational expansion will lead to further migration and unemployment. The Tudaro model also has important policy implications for curtailing public investment in higher education. This heavy influx of rural migrants into urban areas at rates much in excess of new employment opportunities necessitates rationing in the selection of new employees. Fourth is the wage subsidies and traditional scarcity factor pricing can be counterproductive. So as noted in Chapter 5, the Appendix 5.1, a standard economic policy prescription for generating urban employment opportunities is to eliminate factor price distortions by using correct prices, perhaps implemented by wage subsidies or fixed government subsidies employers for each worker employed or direct government hiring. Because actual urban wages generally exceed the market or correct wage as a result of a variety of institutional factors, it is often argued that the elimination of wage distortions through price adjustments of a subsidy systems will encourage more labor-intensive modes of production. Finally, programs of integrated rural development should be encouraged. Policies that operate only on the demand side of the urban employment picture, such as wage subsidies, direct government hiring, elimination of factor price distortions, and employers' tax incentives, are probably far less effective in the long run in alleviating the unemployment problem than policies designed directly to regulate the supply of labor to urban areas. Clearly, however, some combination of both kinds of policies is most desirable. 7.7 A comprehensive urbanization, migration, and employment strategy. So, developing country cities are projected to grow by more than 2 billion people over the next 3 decades. This presents enormous challenges for the developing world, but at the same time, important economic development opportunities. The pattern of urban settlements tends to be very persistent, so the quality of planning now for this enormous transformation will have ramifications for decades to come. Based on long-term trends, the comparison with developed countries and still strong individual incentives, continued urbanization and rural urban migration are probably inevitable. So we have the 10K elements that reflect the complex and nuanced nature of the topic with potentially excessive migration relative to urban opportunities partly due to low productivity, poor rural institutions, and harsh social conditions, and the great and still not fully tapped opportunities for urban dynamism as an engine of economic development. First is creating an appropriate rural-urban economic balance. A more appropriate balance between rural and urban economic opportunities appears to be indispensable to ameliorating both urban and rural unemployment problems and to showing the pace of excessive rural urban migration. Second is the expansion of small scale labor intensive industries. The composition or product mix of output has obvious effects on the magnitude and in many cases the location of employment opportunities because some of products, often basic consumer goods, require more labor per unit of output and per unit of capital than others. Third is eliminating factor price distortions. So there is ample evidence to demonstrate that correcting factor price distortions, primarily by eliminating various capital subsidies and curtailing the growth of urban wages through market-based pricing, would increase employment opportunities and make better use of scarce capital resources. Fourth is choosing appropriate labor intensive technologies of production. One of the principal factors inhibiting the success of any long run programs of employment creation in both urban industry and rural agriculture is the almost complete technological dependence on typically labor saving machinery and equipment from developed countries. Fifth is the modifying the linkage between education and employment. The emergence of the phenomenon of the educated unemployed is calling into question the appropriateness of the massive quantitative expansion of educational systems, especially at the higher levels. Formal education has become the rationing tunnel through which all prospective job holders must pass. Sixth is reducing population's growth. This is the most efficient accomplished through reductions in absolute poverty and inequality, particularly for women, along with the expanded provision of family planning and rural health services. The labor force size for the next 2 decades is already determined by today's birth rates, and hidden momentum of population growth applies as well to labor force growth. Seven is decentralizing authority to cities, neighborhoods. Experience shows that decentralization of authority to municipalities is an essential step in the improvement of urban policies and the quality of public services. Local conditions vary greatly among small and large cities, as well as across different national regions, and policies need to be designed to reflect these differences. Eight is leveraging untapped opportunities for urban dynamism. With strong pro-rural development policies in place, many developing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America can still make gains in harnessing the growth potential of developing country cities, with ongoing attention to preparing for its possible migration implications. 9 is addressing the disparate poverty needs of the poor now living in urban slums conditions. As poor rural residents continue to migrate to urban areas, there is a growing phenomenon of the urbanization of global poverty. Even if more than half of the poor would be found in rural areas for the next decades, as, as Martin Ravelion, Xiao Sochen, and Prem Sangrola concluded, by fostering economic growth, urbanization helped reduce absolute poverty in the aggregate but did little for urban poverty. Lastly, anticipating and assisting the new climate migrants. In related point, one major response to climate change is rural to urban migration on Chapter 10, Section 10.3. This needs to be anticipated and planned for. A critical part of the solution is more effective rural development from better access to sustainable migration to improved rural institutions. So we return to the topic of rural development in Chapter 9 and environment and development in Chapter 10. We conclude by not noting that while a much higher share of population is inevitable, the tempo and pattern of urbanization will be key determinants of whether the deeper objectives of economic development are achieved.